The Arkansas River Valley in Colorado does not forgive the soft. It does not forgive the proud. And it does not forgive those who mistake a mild autumn for a gentle winter. By the middle of October 1881, the cottonwoods along the river had already shed their gold. The leaves lay in drifts against the split-rail fences, rattling like old paper. Whenever the wind came down from the Sawatch Range, and the wind came down often now, it carried the smell of snow from peaks that had been dusted white since the first week of September peaks that watched the valley the way an old judge watches a courtroom, silent and certain of the verdict to come. In the settlement, men were preparing. That is what men did in October. They split cordwood until their shoulders burned. They chinked the gaps between their logs with moss and clay and handfuls of dried grass. They banked the north sides of their root cellars with straw and manure. They checked the seals on their window frames and they cursed the ones that let in daylight. They killed their hogs and hung the hams in the smokehouses. They sharpened axes. They laid in stores of tallow and lamp oil and flour. They did what their fathers had done and what their fathers' fathers had done back through the long chain of winters that stretched behind them into the memory of the country. What they did not do as a general rule was play in the mud. And yet at the small cabin at the end of the settlement road, that is precisely what a woman appeared to be doing. Her name was Ershebet Naj. She was 64 years old. Her hair, which had been the color of wheat in her youth, was now the color of ash, pulled back and pinned tight against her skull in the severe Hungarian fashion. Her hands were not the hands of a farm wife. They were broad across the palm and thickened at the knuckles, with the particular kind of strength that comes not from milking or churning, but from 40 years of pressing clay into vaulted shapes, of handling firebrick and trowel and tamper, until those tools became extensions of the bone. Her eyes were gray and they did not waver. On that October morning, she stood at the base of her cabin's north wall, with a shovel in her hand and a wheelbarrow at her side. She was stripped to a heavy linen work shirt. Her sleeves rolled to the elbows, despite the chill. Her skirt was bunched and tied up around her calves with a length of cord, the way peasant women had done it in the great plain of Hungary for 1,000 years. Her boots, worn through at the toe, were caked in the ochre-colored clay that she had been excavating from a pit 50 yards down the slope near the bend in the creek. She did not appear to be in a hurry. She worked the way a stonemason works, or the way a woman kneads bread that has all afternoon to rise. She would shovel a quantity of the heavy clay into the wheelbarrow, wheel it to the cabin, and dump it at the base of the wall. Then she would kneel slowly, with the deliberate care of a body that no longer bent the way it once did, and she would press the clay into place with the flat of her hands. She would mix in handfuls of dry bunch grass she had gathered by the armload in September, braiding the grass into the clay the way a baker braids the long strands of a festival loaf. Then she would ease the knot from her back with a hand pressed to her hip and begin again. It was a strange thing to see. It was especially strange because the cabin behind her was not in need of repair. It was a sound little house. It had tight saddle-notch corners. It had a proper stone foundation. It had a roof that had been laid with care by a man who knew his trade. By every visible measure, it was as good a cabin as any in the valley. Yet the old woman was burying it. She was piling up the earth against its walls like a person constructing a grave for something that had not yet died. That was what the men in the valley began to say in the first week. That was what Orville Pritchett said. sitting on the seat of his wagon as he came up the rutted track with Jedediah Crane beside him. Orville was a broad man in his early 50s, red-faced, quick with an opinion, and slow to abandon one. He reined in his team and he watched her work for a long moment. And then he laughed the short, barking laugh of a man who finds the world confirming what he already thought about it. "Ma'am," he called out, "are you fixing to turn that house of yours into a badger den?" She did not answer him. She did not even lift her head. She went on pressing the clay into place, patient as a clock. Jedediah Crane did not laugh. Crane was the settlement's best carpenter. He was 45 tall and built square through the shoulders like the barns he framed. He wore a leather apron even when he was not working, and his hands, though large, moved with the particular economy of a man who had spent 30 years learning not to waste motion. His beard was still dark, but shot with gray at the chin. His eyes were the cold blue of a winter creek. He did not laugh at Orville's joke because Jedediah Crane did not laugh at much of anything. He watched the old woman work, and a small furrow deepened between his brows, and he said nothing for a long time. "She's been at it 4 days," Orville said. "My wife says she started on Monday morning and hasn't stopped but to sleep." "I know when she started," Crane said. "You reckon she's lost her wits? Grief does that, I'm told. Her man passed back in the old country from what I hear. Came over with her sister and the 2 little ones. Maybe it caught up to her." Crane did not answer. He clicked his tongue at the team and the wagon moved on, and he did not look back at the cabin, although he wanted to. That evening, over his supper, Jedediah Crane said nothing to his wife about what he had seen, but he could not get the picture out of his head. The old woman alone at the base of that wall, the slow, patient motion of her hands, the way she had not answered Orville not because she had not heard him, but because she had not considered him worth an answer. He had seen that look before a long time ago on the face of a stonemason his father had once hired to set the foundation of the family barn in Pennsylvania. The stonemason had been an old man, too, and German and very quiet. Jedediah had been a boy of 10, and he had watched the old man work, and he had asked his father why the old man did not answer when the hired hands joked with him. His father had said, "Son, when a man knows exactly what he's doing, he's got no time to explain it to a man who doesn't." He did not know why that memory came back to him that night. He put it out of his mind. He went to bed. To understand why Elizabeth Nage was burying her cabin in mud, you would have to go back. You would have to cross an ocean. You would have to travel to the flat brown country outside the city of Debrecen in the eastern part of Hungary, where the wind comes across the steppe without meeting any hill to slow it down. That wind has a name in the old language. They call it the breath of the plain, and it has taught the people there for 1,000 years that a house must do more than shelter. A house must hold. Elizabeth had been born in a village of thatched roofs and whitewashed walls in the year 1817. Her father had been a kemenschipito, which meant in the rough English of the frontier, an oven builder. But that word did not carry the weight of what he was. In Hungary, the kemenschipito was a master craftsman. He built the great domed clay ovens that stood in the corner of every peasant house, ovens that baked bread, cured meat, warmed the bodies of the sick, and radiated a steady winter heat for days after a single firing. He built the larger ovens for the village bakeries. He built the vaulted hearths for the manor houses. He was in his way a keeper of fire. He understood what fire was and what it was not. He understood that fire was not warmth. Fire was only a tool. Warmth was something you built around the fire, the way you built a basket around a fragile egg. Erzsébet had been the third of 4 daughters, and her father had no sons. In another family, this might have meant she learned only to spin and sew and cook. But her father was a strange man, a man who did not fit his village. He had traveled in his youth down into Transylvania and up into Bohemia, and he had come back with ideas that unsettled his neighbors. He had looked at his third daughter when she was 7 years old, and he had seen in her the thing that had been in himself at that age, the thing that wanted to know how the heat moved through the clay. And so he had taken her into the workshop, and he had put a small trowel into her hand, and he had begun to teach her. The women in the village had been scandalized. Girls did not handle fire brick. Girls did not climb scaffolding to lay the crown of a vault. Girls did not stand waist-deep in a clay pit mixing mortar with their bare feet. But Erzsébet's father had only shrugged and said that the clay did not know the difference, and if the clay did not know, then God did not know. And if God did not know, then what business was it of the village? She had learned, and she had learned well. By the time she was 20, she could dome a vault by eye. By the time she was 25, she could tell the quality of a clay deposit by rolling a pinch of it between her fingers and touching it to her tongue. By the time she was 30, she had begun to take commissions of her own, under her father's name at first, and then under her own name, when her father's hands began to tremble and his eyes began to dim. She built ovens. She built hundreds of them. She built them for peasant cottages and for the parish church, and once for the summer kitchen of a minor Magyar nobleman who paid her in silver and called her a witch behind her back. Though he ate the bread that her oven produced for the rest of his life and praised it at every table he sat at, she had married a man named Laszlo Farkas, a cooper, a maker of barrels, a quiet man with large hands and a slow smile. They had one son. The son had grown and married and given her 2 grandchildren, a boy and a girl. And then in the space of 3 years, she had lost them all. Laszlo to a cough that would not leave his chest, her son to a fever, her daughter-in-law to the same fever a week later. The 2 grandchildren, Balint and Ildiko, had come to her bed on the night of their mother's funeral and had not left her side for a year. Her sister, Clara Dobos, had been widowed the winter before. Clara had no children. When the news came of a country across the sea, where a woman with strong hands could buy land for almost nothing and begin again, it had been Clara who had first said the word aloud. America. They had sold the workshop. They had sold the house. They had sold the little piece of pasture her husband had left her. They had packed the trowel and the tamper and 3 of her father's old iron oven rakes, and they had come. Erzsébet had been 63 years old when she stepped off the ship. She was 64 now, and she was burying her cabin in mud. The reason was the winter before. That first winter in Colorado had been by the measure of the valley an ordinary winter. It had been cold, but not unusually cold. It had snowed, but not unusually much. The creek had frozen to a depth of 8 inches, and then it had thawed, and then it had frozen again, which was what the creek did every year, and every year the men of the valley cursed it and broke the ice with axes so their stock could drink. For Erzsébet, it had not been an ordinary winter. It had been a revelation, and a terrible one. The cabin, which Crane himself had built and sold to her in the spring of 1880, was by his own judgment a good one. It had tight chinking. It had a well-drawn stove. It had a door that fit its frame. And yet from the first hard frost of November through the last thaw of April, that cabin had been a place of slow, grinding misery. She had watched a film of ice form on the water bucket every morning no more than 10 feet from the stove. She had watched the stew she cooked cool from a steaming pot to a congealed, greasy mass in the time it took to ladle it into 4 bowls and carry the bowls to the table. She had felt the drafts. Not great gales, but thin, insidious rivers of cold that flowed along the floor and chilled her ankles, no matter how close she drew her chair to the fire. She had put the children to bed in their wool coats and wool caps, and still Ildiko had woken coughing, and still Balint had woken with his lips a pale, waxy blue. She had watched the woodpile shrink at a rate that terrified her. She had burned through it and through the second woodpile she bought from a neighbor at twice the price, and through a third she bought in desperation from a freight driver. Passing through in February, she had sat by the red glowing stove and she had put her palm to the log wall 5 feet from the firebox, and she had felt the cold coming through, as though the wall were not there at all. And she had watched the frost, the thing her neighbors called rime, grow on the inside of her own walls. Feathery white crystals, beautiful in the lamplight, creeping up the logs. The moisture of her own breath. The moisture of the stew pot. The moisture of the children's sleep. All of it migrating to the cold wood and freezing there. Her house was breathing and the breath was turning to ice inside its own chest. She had understood by Christmas of that first winter what was wrong. She was a builder of ovens. She understood what held heat and what did not. She looked at her cabin and she saw the thing that Crane and Orville and every man in the valley had failed to see, not because they were fools, but because they had grown up in a country of trees and had never been taught to see it. The logs were not a wall. The logs were a membrane. They were a thin skin stretched between her family and the cold. They had almost no mass, and without mass there was nothing to hold the heat. She had spent the summer thinking. She had walked the pit near the creek, and she had taken up handfuls of the clay, and she had rolled it between her fingers, and she had touched it to her tongue, and she had tasted the old taste, the taste of the clay of Debrecen, faint but unmistakable. She had walked the banks of the creek, and she had seen the bunch grass growing in clumps, and she had remembered her father saying, "A good clay wants a stalk in it, a hollow reed, a little empty place for the cold to get lost in." By September, she had known what she would build. By October, she had begun. Clara did not understand at first. Clara was 58, a small bird-bone woman with a quick laugh and a quicker temper. She had trusted her sister her whole life. When Erzsébet said they would come to America, Clara had come. When Erzsébet said they would settle in Colorado, Clara had settled in Colorado. She had not questioned. But on the 4th night of the digging, when Erzsébet came into the cabin with her hands bleeding and her knees trembling, and could not lift her spoon without her arm shaking, Clara had questioned. She had waited until the children were asleep. She had waited until the stove was banked. She had sat down across the pine table from her sister, and she had taken her sister's raw hands in her own, and she had said in Hungarian, in a voice that was very quiet and very steady. "Erzi, you are 64. You will die before this is finished. And then what becomes of the children?" Erzsébet did not pull her hands away. She looked at her sister across the table for a long moment, and the lamplight moved in her gray eyes. "Klarica," she said, "if I do not build it, they will die before I do." Clara's mouth tightened. Her eyes shone. "You do not know that," she said. "Last winter we lived. We were cold and we were poor, and the boy coughed, but we lived. You are asking me to watch you break yourself apart for a thing you are not sure of." "I am sure of it," Erzsébet said. "You are stubborn," Clara said, and the word came out with a sudden heat. "You are stubborn the way Papa was stubborn. You are stubborn the way Laszlo was stubborn when the cough started, and he would not rest. And you will go the same way they went." Erzsébet was silent for a long time. "Do you remember," she said at last, "the oven in Papa's kitchen?" "Of course I remember it." "Do you remember what he said about it?" "He said a great many things. He was always talking. He said the oven was a promise. He said a man builds an oven for his children and his children's children, because a good oven outlives a man by 100 years. He said that when the snow comes and the wolf is at the door, the oven is what stands between the wolf and the child." Clara did not answer. "I cannot cut trees, Klarica. I cannot split logs. I cannot frame a roof. I have one skill. I have one thing my father gave me. And if I do not use it now when the wolf is at the door, then what was it for?" Clara let go of her sister's hands. She stood up. She walked to the stove, and she stood with her back to the table, and her shoulders shook once, and then were still. "I will sleep in the other room tonight," she said. She did. It was the first night they had slept apart since they had left Hungary. Erzsébet lay in the narrow bed with Ildikó curled against her side, and she listened to the wind moving along the ridgeline. And she did not close her eyes until nearly dawn. In the morning, Clara came out of the other room with her hair pinned up and her apron tied, and she set the coffee on the stove, and she did not speak to her sister. But she did not leave. And that was a kind of answer, and Erzsébet took it, and she went out and she kept digging. Balint was 10 years old. He was a quiet boy with his grandfather's slow smile and his mother's dark eyes, and he had not spoken more than 3 sentences a day since his parents had died. That morning, as Erzsébet pushed the wheelbarrow up the slope from the pit, he came out of the cabin in his coat and his cap, and he took the handles of the wheelbarrow from her without a word, and he began to push, and she let him. He was a small boy for his age, and the barrow was heavy, and he had to lean his whole weight into it to keep it moving through the mud. But he moved it. He moved it to the north wall, and he tipped it, and the clay fell in a wet heap, and he turned the barrow around, and he pushed it back down the slope to the pit. And he did not look at her, and she did not look at him, and neither of them spoke. They worked like that until noon, when Clara rang the iron bell for dinner. The boy set the barrow down, and he wiped his nose on the back of his glove, and he said in Hungarian the first full sentence he had spoken in a week. "It is going to be a good wall, Najimama." She did not trust herself to answer. She put her hand on his shoulder for a moment, and then she took it away, and they went into the cabin and ate their soup. The visits from the neighbors began the following week. They came under the cover of various pretenses. a borrowed cup of flour, a question about a strayed calf, a word about the coming weather. But they all came to look. The Hungarian widow's mud hill, they called it, when they thought she could not hear. Farkas's folly, some of them said, which stung her in a place deeper than they knew, because Farkas had been her husband's name and she was called Nagy only by the strict usage of her maiden family. But the men in the valley had heard somewhere that Farkas was a Hungarian name and they had fixed on it, and they would not be moved. Jedediah Crane came at the end of the second week. He came alone on horseback in the late afternoon with the sun already dropping behind the Sawatch. He dismounted at the edge of her property with the slow, deliberate movement of a man performing a duty he did not relish. He did not tie his horse. He walked up the slope to where she was working at the east wall, and he stopped 10 feet from her and he stood with his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said. She straightened. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. She looked at him and she waited. "Ma'am, I built that cabin," he said. "I laid its corners and I cut its logs. I know what I put into it, and I know what it can stand and what it can't. I didn't come out here to mock you. I came because I think maybe no one has told you straight." She watched him. She did not speak. "Those logs are green pine," he said. "They have not cured out yet, not fully. When you bury them in wet clay, ma'am, they can't breathe. And when the spring thaw comes, that earth of yours is going to soak through like a sponge. Those logs are going to draw that water, and they are going to sweat, and they are going to rot. By May, you will have punk wood holding your roof up. By next October, that wall will fall in on your sister and those 2 children." He paused. He turned his hat in his hands. "I build things to stand for 30 years, ma'am. I can't be any part of building a thing that won't stand through one. If you want to berm the north side with a little sod, I can understand that. My grandfather did it in Pennsylvania. But this, what you are doing here, this is not a berm. This is a mound. You are digging a grave for your own house." He finished. He waited. Erzsébet set the shovel down. She walked slowly to the section of the north wall where she had finished her first course of packed earth 3 weeks before. She laid her palm against it. It was cool and firm and dry as a biscuit. "Mr. Crane," she said. Her English was slow and thickened by the vowels of her native tongue. "In my country, we say that the clay pulls the fever from the sick child." "Yes." He frowned. He did not answer. "It pulls the fever. It takes the heat. It draws." She patted the wall softly twice. "And the same. It pulls the water from the wood. It does not give water. It takes." "Ma'am, that is not how the clay breathes, Mr. Crane." She said it simply. She did not argue, and she did not raise her voice, and she did not try to convince him. She said it the way a woman states the sun rises in the east. She said it, and then she turned back to her shovel, and she lifted another load, and she began to pack it onto the wall. Jedediah Crane stood for another moment with his hat in his hands. Then he put the hat on his head, and he walked down to his horse, and he mounted and he rode away. He did not come back to her cabin that autumn. He had told himself on the ride home that he had done his duty. He had warned her. What she did now was on her head, and on her sister's, and on the heads of those 2 silent, dark-eyed children. He told himself that for a long time. He almost believed it. It was Ildiko who broke Erzsébet's heart in the end. Ildiko was 7. She was a slight, watchful child with her mother's thin wrists and her grandmother's gray eyes. She was the kind of child who noticed everything and said almost nothing. She had started school in the settlement that September. A one-room school kept by a Methodist minister's wife, and she had come home each afternoon with her lunch pail swinging from her hand and a fierce set look on her small face that Erzsébet had not understood. On a cold evening in the first week of November, with the wind rattling the stovepipe, Ildiko came through the door, and she did not take off her coat. She stood by the stove and her shoulders began to shake, and at first, Erzsébet thought she was only cold. Then she saw that the child was crying silently, the way she had cried at her mother's grave in Hungary, the way some children cry when they have learned young that crying aloud changes nothing. Erzsébet knelt down. Her knees protested. She took the child by both shoulders. Kichim, what is it? What has happened? The child would not look at her. Ildiko, tell me. They say you are crazy, Najimama. The words came out in Hungarian in a whisper. They say you have lost your mind. The Pritchett boy says it. He says his father says it. He says his father says the whole valley is laughing at our house. She drew in a sharp breath. He says we live in a pigsty, Najimama. He says we are dirty Hungarians who do not know how to live in a proper house. Erzsébet felt the thing in her chest that she had not felt since Laszlo had died. It was not anger, although anger was in it. It was something older and deeper than anger. It was the thing that had made her father teach her to lay a vault when the village said a girl should not. It was the thing that had kept her on her feet beside 3 open graves. It was the thing that had put her on a ship at 63 years of age, with a trowel wrapped in a piece of flannel. At the bottom of her trunk, she did not speak for a moment. She gathered the child against her and she held her, and she felt the small bones of the child's back and the shuddering of the child's breath, and she waited until the crying had passed. Then she took the child's face in her hands and she turned it up to her own. She wiped the tears with her thumbs. Her hands left faint streaks of ochre on the child's cheeks, the color of the clay, the color of the house she was building. Ildiko, she said, listen to me now. Listen carefully, because your grandmother is going to tell you something and you must remember it your whole life. The child looked up at her. The child was very still. The cold is coming, Erzsébet said. The cold that is coming this winter will not be the cold of last winter. I can feel it in the wind. I have felt such winters before in the old country, in the year of your uncle's birth. It will be a cold that kills. It will take the weak. It will take the foolish. It will take the proud. She paused. She held the child's eyes. When it comes, Ildiko, the boys in the valley will not be laughing anymore. Their fathers will not be laughing. They will be cold and they will be frightened, and some of them will be burning the boards of their own fences to keep alive. And we, Najimama, we will be warm, child. We will be warm the way your great-grandfather's house was warm in the worst winters of Hungary when the wolves came down from the mountains and stood in the square of Debrecen. We will be warm because your grandmother knows a thing that they do not know. Your grandmother knows what the clay can do. The child's lip trembled. Promise, I promise you, Ildiko Farkas. On the grave of your mother, I promise you. And I want you to remember this night. I want you to remember standing in this kitchen with your coat still on, and your grandmother with the clay under her fingernails. Because one day when you are old, you will tell this story to a child of your own, and the child will ask you if it is true. And you will say, yes, it is true. My grandmother told me the cold was coming, and the cold came, and she was ready. The child nodded. Slowly, once. Erzsébet kissed her on the forehead. She stood. Her knees cracked. She went to the door, and she pulled on her coat, and she took the lantern from the peg. Where are you going, Nagi Mama? To work a little longer, Kixim. Go to your aunt. Tell her to warm the soup. She went out into the wind. By the end of November, the berm was 80% finished. It ran around 3 sides of the cabin, the north and the east and the west, leaving the south wall with its single small window uncovered so that the low winter sun could still reach the logs. At its base, where it met the stone foundation, it was 6 feet thick. It tapered as it rose, narrowing to 3 feet just below the eaves of the roof. It was not a wall. It was a hill. It was a long, low-sloped shoulder of packed earth, smooth as a loaf of rye bread, curving around the cabin in a slow embrace. The cabin itself, seen from the road, no longer looked like a cabin. It looked like a dwelling, half-submerged, something that had risen partway out of the land, or something that the land had partway reclaimed. The roof stuck up above the berm like the crown of a hat. The stovepipe smoked from the center of it. The south-facing window caught the morning sun and held it. And from certain angles, when the light was right, the whole structure seemed to glow from within like a lamp wrapped in a heavy cloth. On the last afternoon of November, Erzsébet stood at the bottom of the slope by the creek, and she looked up at what she had made. Her shoulders ached. Her knees ached. Her hands were split at the knuckles, and the cracks had been bleeding, and Clara had bound them that morning with strips of old petticoat soaked in tallow. The sun was dropping behind the Sawatch. The peaks were already in shadow, but the last of the light still lay across the valley floor, and it caught the curve of the berm and turned the clay a deep burning ochre, the color of the earth of her father's village, the color she had not seen since she had left Hungary. She stood for a long time. Then she climbed slowly up the slope to the north wall. She laid her palm against the packed earth. It was cool. It was firm. It was dry. And for the first time since Laszlo had died 4 years ago in the little upstairs room in Debrecen, with the candles guttering on the windowsill and the snow falling on the thatch outside, for the first time in 4 years, Erzsébet Nagy smiled. She did not know, as she stood there, that in 3 weeks' time, the thermometer at the settlement store would drop to 20 below zero and stay there. She did not know that the drivers on the Canyon City Road would be found frozen to their wagons. She did not know that the Pritchett girl would be saved by the thickness of a single wool blanket, and that Jedediah Crane's small son would be saved by a thing Crane himself did not yet understand. She did not know any of it. She only knew that the wall was cool and firm and dry, and that the wolf was coming down from the mountains, and that she, Erzsébet Nagy, 64 years old, daughter of a man who had taught her what the clay could do, was ready. The first snow of the season came down on the night of the 4th of December, 1881. It was a soft snow, a polite snow. The kind of snow that settles on the split-rail fences in a thin white crust and makes the world seem gentler than it is. It fell from dusk until well past midnight, and it left behind a blanket of perhaps 4 inches across the valley floor. In the morning, the children of the settlement ran out of their cabins and threw handfuls of it at one another, and their laughter carried down the road like the sound of small bells. Urgebet Nad did not laugh. She stood in the doorway of her cabin with a tin mug of black coffee in her hand, and she watched the snow, and her face was the face of a woman reading a letter she had been waiting a long time to receive. She understood what the snow meant. She understood it the way her father had understood it, and her father's father, and every Kemensepitu who had ever walked out in the hour before dawn to check the draw of a newly built oven. The snow meant that the ground had given up its last warmth. It meant that the thermal ceiling had dropped. It meant that the clear skies would come next, and after the clear skies, the cold that had no bottom. She sipped her coffee, and she did not move for a long time. And then she went inside, and she began to prepare. She brought the wood in from the pile at the back of the cabin, and she stacked it against the inside wall beside the stove, not a week's worth, but a month's. She took the iron pot down from its nail, and she set it on the back of the stove with water in it, because she knew that in the cold that was coming, the air would grow so dry that the children would wake with nosebleeds. She took down the crock of sourdough starter that Clara had been feeding since October, and she set it on the shelf above the stove where the heat would hold. She fetched a fresh sack of flour from the root cellar, and she stood it beside the stove. She checked the lamp oil. She checked the matches. She trimmed the wicks. Then she went outside, and she walked the full perimeter of the berm, and she laid her hand on it every few feet, the way a doctor lays a hand on a patient. She was feeling for hairline cracks, for soft places, for any sign that the autumn frosts had opened a seam. She found nothing. The wall was hard. The wall was sound. She came back inside, and she hung up her coat, and she said to Clara in a very calm voice, "It comes now, Clarica. 2 days. 3 at the most." Clara set down the bowl she was drying. She did not argue. She only said, "Yol van noverkem." "All right, little sister." And she went to the cupboard, and she began counting the jars of preserves. Balint, the boy, had taken to sleeping by the stove. He had made himself a kind of nest there, with a folded quilt and the wool blanket his mother had woven for him before she died. His grandmother had not forbidden it. She understood. A child who had lost what Balin had lost did not want to sleep in a cold bed at the far end of a cabin. He wanted to sleep where he could hear the fire and where he could see his grandmother's boots when she rose in the night to feed it. He had stopped coughing in the last 2 weeks. That was worth a dozen moved quilts. The boy had begun to help his grandmother in a way that went beyond the pushing of the wheelbarrow. In the evenings, while Clara darned and Ildiko bent over her slate Balint, would come to his grandmother where she sat on the bench by the stove, and he would ask her quietly about the work. He asked her why she had mixed the grass into the clay. He asked her why the south wall had been left uncovered. He asked her why the base of the berm was thicker than the top. She answered him the way her own father had answered her 70 years ago in another country. She did not simplify. She did not use baby words. She spoke to him as a craftsman speaks to an apprentice slowly, with long pauses letting each answer settle in his mind before she moved on to the next. The grass kisvium is a small thing, but it matters. Each stalk of grass is hollow. Each stalk is a tiny empty room. When I mix the grass into the clay takes those rooms into itself. It becomes a wall full of small empty rooms. The cold cannot walk through an empty room the way it walks through solid earth. The cold gets lost. He thought about that. He nodded. And the south wall, the sun kisviam. The sun in winter is low and it comes from the south. If I cover the south wall, I lock the sun out. I do not want to lock the sun out. I want the sun to come into the logs and warm them from the outside during the day. Then, when the sun is gone, my wall on the other 3 sides holds the heat in. The sun gives. The wall keeps. And the thickness? Here she had smiled and she had reached out, and she had tapped him once gently on the forehead. Here, Balint. Here is your answer. Where is the head of a thing heaviest at the bottom? The cold is heavy. The cold sinks to the floor of a room. The cold sinks to the foot of a wall. It pools there like water. So where must the wall be thickest? At the bottom where the cold pools. At the top where the heat rises and only a little cold reaches. I do not need so much. I use what I need. I do not waste clay, and I do not waste breath, and I do not waste days of my life. The boy had been silent for a long time after that. Then he had said, Nagi Mama, is that what an oven is too? Is an oven a house for heat? She had looked at him. She had looked at him for a long moment. And then she had said, Yes, Kisviam. That is what an oven is. That is what this house is. The oven holds the heat so the bread can rise. This house holds the heat so the winter cannot kill us. She had paused. You are your great-grandfather's great-grandson. I had forgotten for a little while that such a thing could be passed down. I will not forget it again. The boy's dark eyes had filled, and he had looked down at his hands. And Erzsébet had understood then why the cold was coming and why she had built what she had built. And she had been for a single full minute at peace. The real cold arrived on the night of the 16th of December. It came the way she had said it would. The sky cleared at sunset, emptying of clouds, as if an iron lid had been lifted from the valley. The stars came out, and there were more of them than seemed possible, and they burned with a hard metallic light. The wind stopped. The absence of the wind was almost more alarming than its presence would have been, because it meant the air was heavy now, and settling, pooling in the low places, thickening against the earth. Erzsébet went out at midnight to read the thermometer that hung beside the door. The mercury stood at 12 below zero. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went back inside, and she added a log to the stove, and she went to bed. By dawn, the thermometer read -19. By the second night, it read -23. By the third, -27. The cold snap which would be remembered in the valley for a generation as simply the winter of '81 had begun. There is a particular quality to cold of that severity that a man who has not felt it cannot imagine from reading about it. It is not the cold of a cold room or the cold of a January morning in a town. It is a substance. It has weight. It presses on the lungs and on the bones of the face and on the backs of the hands. It freezes the inside of the nose with the first breath. It cracks green wood like pistol shots in the night. It stops the breath of small animals in their burrows. It turns a spilled cup of coffee to a dark lens of ice before the cup has finished rolling. In the Pritchett cabin, half a mile down the valley, Orville Pritchett discovered on the morning of the third day that his woodpile was not going to last him another week. He had laid in by his own judgment a generous supply in October. 4 full cords split and stacked. He had burned more than half of it in 3 days. He stood in his yard in the brittle morning light with his breath freezing on the wool of his muffler, and he stared at the diminished pile, and a small cold hand took hold of his stomach, and it did not let go. Inside his cabin, his wife Hetty had taken every woolen blanket they owned off the beds and had hung them over the windows and the door. The cabin was dark at noon. Their daughter, Prudence, 8 years old, sat on a stool 3 feet from the stove, wrapped in her father's heavy buffalo coat, and she coughed and coughed and coughed, a dry, barking cough that had been going on for a day and a half and showed no sign of stopping. The frost on the inside of the north wall had climbed halfway to the ceiling. When Orville went to the water barrel that morning, he had found the water frozen solid to within an inch of the bottom, and he had broken the ice with the poker, and his hand had shaken. In the Crane cabin, a quarter of a mile in the other direction, matters were somewhat better, because Jedediah Crane was the best builder in the valley, and his own house was the best built house in the settlement. But better was a relative word. His wife Winifred was not a complainer, but by the third evening her lips were a pale lavender color, and she had stopped sewing because her fingers would not hold the needle. Their son Ephraim, 6 years old, had a fever of 102. He lay on the pallet by the stove, and he did not move much. And when Crane put his palm to the boy's forehead, he felt the fever fighting against the cold, and he knew which one was going to win if the cold did not break. Crane sat up that night at the kitchen table with his Bible in front of him, and he did not read it. He stared at the wall beside the stove, at the place where the red iron was radiating its heat, and he watched the heat vanish. He watched it disappear into the logs, and he understood in a way he had not understood before that every BTU he forced into his stove was being sucked straight through his walls and given up to the outside air. He was heating the valley. He was heating Colorado. He was heating the stars. He thought, although he would not have admitted it to anyone, of the old woman's wall. He thought of the way she had said, "The clay breathes." He thought of her hand laid flat against that dark mound of dirt, and the calm in her gray eyes, and the quiet patience with which she had turned back to her shovel. He shook his head. He got up. He fed the stove another log. He went to bed beside Winifred, and he pulled 3 quilts up to his chin, and he did not sleep. In the Naj cabin, the reality was different. It was not dramatic. That was the thing that neither Erzsébet nor Clara could quite get used to. There was no miracle. There was no blazing heat. There was only simply the absence of the catastrophe that was overtaking every other house in the valley. The stove was fed, but it was fed calmly with a single split of pine every 2 hours or so. Not the frantic shoveling of fuel that Orville Pritchett was doing half a mile away. The air in the cabin was still. There were no cold currents moving along the floor. Ildiko in her wool stockings could sit cross-legged on the braided rug in the middle of the room and play with the rag doll Clara had made her. and she did not shiver. The water bucket on the bench by the door had a film of ice on it, each morning no thicker than a fingernail. The crock of sourdough starter on the shelf above the stove continued to bubble and sigh alive. Most remarkable of all to Clara was the windowsill. Erzsébet had built on the inside of the south-facing window a small clay trough plastered to the sill. She had filled it with soil from the creek bank, and she had planted in it a handful of chives she had nursed through the summer in a tin can. In any other cabin in the valley in that week, those chives would have been a frozen mat of dead green pulp. In the Naj cabin, they stood upright slender, their dark tips catching the winter sun that came through the glass for 5 hours each day. They grew. In the middle of the deadliest winter the valley had seen on a windowsill that stood inside the walls of a log cabin. Green things grew. Clara stood at that window on the 4th morning of the cold snap, and she put her finger against the pane, and she watched the frost that had formed there retreat from the warmth of her fingertip. And she turned and she looked at her sister, and she said very quietly, "Erzsé, igazad volt. Erzsé, you were right." Erzsébet looked up from the stove. She did not smile. She only said, "Még nem kicsi testvér, még nincs vége." Not yet, little sister. It is not yet over. She was correct. On the afternoon of the 4th day, as Erzsébet was carrying an armful of split pine in from the pile, she stopped at the corner of the north wall, and she looked at it, and she went very still. There was a crack. It was a thin crack no wider than the edge of a knife, but it ran from a point about 4 feet up on the wall down to the base, a long dark line in the smooth ochre of the berm. It was the kind of crack that a layman would not have noticed. It was the kind of crack that would have meant nothing to Jedediah Crane or to Orville Pritchett. But Erzsébet knew what it was. She had seen such cracks 100 times in her life in the faces of ovens that had been fired for the first time and not properly tempered. It was a thermal stress crack. The extreme cold outside and the warmth bleeding from the cabin inside were fighting each other through the thickness of the wall, and the clay at this one point had given. It was not a disaster. Not yet. But if it was not repaired and if the cold held, the crack would widen. Cold air would begin to flow through it. The inside face of the berm, which was now warm, would chill. The stored heat in that section of the wall would drain. The crack would grow from a knife's edge to a finger's width, and then to a hand's width. And then that whole section of the berm would fail, and the cold would find a way through the logs, and the cabin would begin to lose what it had gained. She set down the wood. She walked slowly back to the kitchen door. She stood in the doorway and she looked at Clara, who was kneading bread at the table. "Clarica," she said, "I must go out. There is a fault in the wall." Clara stopped kneading. She looked up. She looked at her sister's face and at the way her sister was holding her left hand against her hip. And then she looked out the window at the white, savage light of the afternoon. "Erzsé, it is 30 below zero out there. I know. You cannot work clay in such cold. The water will freeze before you can mix it. I can warm the water on the stove. I can work quickly. Erzsé, no. It can wait until tomorrow. It can wait for the weather to turn. The weather will not turn tomorrow, Clarica. And by tomorrow, the crack will be twice the size. By the day after, it will be open. Then the whole wall on this side is lost, and everything I built is lost. And the children, she did not finish. She did not need to finish. The children was enough. Clara set the dough down. She stared at her sister. Her hands were white with flour and trembling slightly. Then I come with you. I warm water. I hand you things. I will not let you do this alone. You stay with the children. You keep the fire. If I am out long, you must not come to find me. You must not open the door more than you need to. Promise me this. Nous verrons. Promise me. Clara bit her lip. She nodded once. Erzsébet went. She put on every layer she owned. 2 pairs of wool stockings. Her heaviest petticoat. Her husband's old wool trousers under her skirt, which she had been too proud to wear for years, and which now she pulled on without thinking. 2 shirts. Her wool coat. A scarf wound twice around her neck and up over her mouth and nose. A knitted cap. Over the cap a wool shawl tied under the chin. She had no proper mittens, only a pair of thin leather gloves that had been Laszlo's, and she pulled them on and she flexed her fingers inside them. And she knew they would not be enough. She went to the stove and she heated a kettle of water nearly to boiling. She poured it into a heavy iron bucket with a lid. She filled a second bucket with dry clay powder she had stored in a crock under the bench. She went outside. The cold hit her like a thrown stone. It was not air. It was an object. It went through the wool and through the skin and into the bone of her chest. And for one long moment she could not draw breath. And she thought Clarica was right. I am 64 years old, and I am going to die out here. And then the moment passed, and she drew one careful, shallow breath, and another, and she began to walk to the north wall. She knelt in the snow. Her knees, even through the layers, felt the cold of the frozen ground. She scraped away the drift at the base of the crack. She pulled off one glove with her teeth. She mixed the hot water with the dry clay quickly in a small wooden bowl. Steam rose. Her bare fingers worked the mixture until it was the consistency of thick soup. The heat of the water was already bleeding out into the cold. She had maybe a minute before it would begin to freeze. She pressed the warm clay into the crack. She worked it in with her bare fingers, forcing it deep, smoothing it from the outside, feeling with her fingertips for the inner edges of the fault. She did this for perhaps 40 seconds. Then her fingers stopped obeying her. They had gone from burning to aching to numb. She pulled the glove back on over the wet clay, and she waited, crouched in the snow, her whole body shaking, while her hand came back to life in a slow wave of agony. Then she did it again. She did it 3 more times, each time with a fresh measure of warm clay, each time with her bare fingers, each time feeling a little less of her hand come back to her when she put the glove on afterward. The crack began to close. She worked her way from the bottom up to the top, pressing, smoothing, packing. By the time she reached the top of the crack, the light was failing and her jaw had set so hard she could not open her mouth, and her eyes were streaming tears that froze to her cheeks in small hard beads. She finished. She smoothed the last patch with the flat of her glove. She stood. Her knees did not want to straighten. She made them straighten. She picked up the bucket and the bowl, and she walked back around the corner of the cabin, and her left foot caught on a drift, and she went down hard on one hip in the snow. She lay there for perhaps 10 seconds looking up at the sky, which was already showing the first cold stars. She thought quite clearly, "Get up, Ertzi. Get up. The children are inside." She got up. She made it to the door. She pushed it open and she fell across the threshold, and Clara caught her under the arms and half dragged her the rest of the way in. That night, Clara did not sleep. She sat on the floor beside the pallet where she had laid her sister. She had stripped the wet clothes from Erzsébet and wrapped her in 3 blankets. She had rubbed the sister's hands with goose grease slowly, finger by finger, for nearly an hour, until the color had begun to return. 2 fingers on the left hand were white at the tip and did not want to come back. Clara had worked them longer. She had held them against her own belly under her own shift, against the warm skin of her abdomen, the oldest trick their mother had taught them, for frostbite the warmth of a living body. She had not cried. Her eyes had been hard and dry and angry. Toward midnight, Erzsébet stirred. She opened her eyes. She looked at her sister. "Clarica, I am here. The children, sleeping. The wall. The wall is mended noverkem. You mended it." Erzsébet nodded once very slowly. She closed her eyes. She was silent for a long time, and Clara thought she had gone back to sleep. Then, without opening her eyes, Erzsébet spoke again in a voice so soft that Clara had to lean down to hear. "Clarica, I was wrong to be sharp with you. That night, at the table, when you said I would die and leave the children. You were not wrong to say it. You were saying it because you love me. I did not see that. I am sorry." Clara bent forward. She pressed her forehead against her sister's shoulder. And now, at last, she wept silently, the way the child Ildiko wept, because she had learned from the same mother, in the same village, that crying aloud changed nothing but crying in silence, was sometimes all a woman had. "Hush, Ertzi. Hush. You were not wrong. You built the wall. You saved the children. You were not wrong about anything. I was wrong to be sharp. Yes, all right, you were wrong to be sharp. I forgive you. Now sleep." She slept. The cold did not break. Day 5. Day 6. The mercury hung between -25 and -30, immovable, like a fact of geology. The sun rose pale and useless and crossed a sky of a pitiless blue, and set again, and the cold only deepened. In the settlement, a rumor passed from cabin to cabin that the Larson boy, a bachelor homesteader on the North Rim, had been found dead in his chair by the stove cold, the door frozen shut from the inside, his last piece of wood burned to gray ash at his feet. Orville Pritchett, on the evening of the 6th day, took his axe into his own yard and began to chop down his fence. He worked by lantern light. His daughter Prudence was worse. Her cough had become wet rattling, and she had grown listless in a way that Hetty did not recognize, and that frightened her more than the coughing. The fence posts were seasoned cedar, and they burned hot. Orville worked until his shoulders would not lift the axe any longer, and then he hauled the pieces into Hetty, who fed them to the stove one at a time, and the stove roared, and Prudence slept shallowly and did not wake when the fire settled. Jedediah Crane on that same evening walked out behind his own cabin and looked at his own woodpile. He had 9 days' worth of wood left at the current rate of burning. He looked up at the sky. The stars were hard and bright. There was no weather in the sky. The cold would not break tomorrow or the day after that or the day after that. He understood for the first time in his life that he might lose his son. He went back inside and he sat by Ephraim's pallet and he put his hand on the boy's hot forehead and he did not move for a long time. On the evening of the 7th day, Erzsébet, who was up and moving again, although her left hand was bound in cloth, and 2 fingertips would always from then on be dead, to sensation stood at the stove, stirring a pot of paprikas. Clara was at the table. Balint was in his nest by the stove reading a primer the minister's wife had lent him. Ildiko was on the braided rug telling a long, quiet story to her doll. There was a knock at the door. Everyone in the cabin went still. A knock at the door at night in the middle of such cold was not a neighborly visit. A knock at the door meant trouble. Erzsébet wiped her good hand on her apron. She nodded to Clara, who moved to stand between the door and the children. Erzsébet opened the door a foot no more. Orville Pritchett stood on the step. He was a figure out of a nightmare. His beard was frosted white. There was blood frozen at one nostril. He was holding his hat in one hand, and the other hand was held at an odd angle cradled against his chest. His eyes in the lamplight that spilled past Erzsébet's shoulder were the eyes of an animal that had run a long way and didn't know where it was. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a croak. "Ma'am, I am Pritchett, from down the road. I know who you are, Mr. Pritchett. Ma'am, my little girl. Prudence, she is 8. She is very sick. Her chest." He stopped. He swallowed. His throat worked. "I have burned my fence. Ma'am, I have burned my fence, and my wood is done, and she is very sick, and my wife said to come. She said there was—" He could not finish. Erzsébet looked at him. She looked at him for perhaps 3 full seconds. She saw a great many things in his face. Some of them old, some of them new. She saw the man who had called her a badger. She saw the man who had spread the name Farkas's Folly up and down the valley. She saw the father of the boy who had made her granddaughter weep in the kitchen. She saw also a man who, after everything, had come on foot in 30 below zero cold to the door of the woman he had mocked because his daughter was dying and he had nowhere else to go. She saw at the center of him a man who had at last been emptied of everything except the love of his child. She opened the door the rest of the way. "Come in, Mr. Pritchett," she said. "Bring your wife and your daughter. Bring them now. Clarica, the big bed. Blankets. Warm bricks. Balint, fetch 3 logs. She turned back to Orville. "How far can you carry the child?" He stared at her. He had not expected this. He had expected, he realized, to be refused. My wife can walk. I can carry Prudence." "Then go. Do not speak to anyone on the road. Bring them here. Do not stop. Run if you can run. Do you understand me?" "Yes, ma'am. Yes." He went. He stumbled down off the step, and he went not running because a man running in that cold would freeze his lungs, but at a fast, hard walk. That was the closest thing to running that the air would allow. He disappeared into the darkness. Erzsébet closed the door. She turned. Clara was already moving. Balint was at the woodpile. Ildiko was standing, her doll forgotten, her gray eyes huge. Naji Mama, the Pritchett girl is coming. Yes, Kitchim. The one whose brother? Yes. Ildiko nodded. Then very gravely she went to the cupboard, and she took out her own wool cap, the red one her aunt had knitted her, and she laid it on the foot of the bed for the Pritchett girl, in case she needed a warm thing that had not been frozen on the road. Erzsébet looked at her granddaughter for a long moment. Her throat tightened. Then she turned and she went to work. The Pritchetts reached the cabin 20 minutes later. Orville carried Prudence wrapped in the buffalo coat. The child was conscious, but only just. Her lips were a pale violet, and her breathing was a faint whistle. Hetty followed, stumbling, her skirt stiff with frozen snow to the knees. Erzsébet took the child from Orville at the door. Hetty tried to speak and could not, and Clara caught her under the arm and brought her to the bench by the stove and wrapped her in a shawl and put a cup of hot water into her hands, one sip at a time. Erzsébet laid the child on the big bed. She stripped the frozen outer layers off her. She called for the warm bricks Clara had been heating in the stove, and she wrapped them in flannel, and she set them along the child's sides and at her feet. She called for goose grease, and she rubbed the child's small hands between her own, slowly the way Clara had rubbed hers 4 nights before. She called for honey and hot water and a pinch of the ground ginger she had carried across the ocean in a stoppered vial, and she made a drink and she spooned it into the child a drop at a time. The child's breathing began to deepen. Her lips began to go from violet to pink. She opened her eyes once and looked up at the strange old woman bending over her, and she did not seem afraid. And then she closed her eyes again and slept. Hetty from the bench watched this, and her face did a thing her face had not done in 8 days. And she bent forward and she put her head in her hands, and her whole body began to shake. Orville stood in the middle of the cabin. He had not taken off his coat. His frozen beard was beginning to thaw, and water ran down his chin, and he did not wipe it away. He looked at the walls. He looked at the walls of that cabin, and he felt the warmth of them, the still patient warmth that was not the warmth of the stove, but some other warmth, a warmth that came from nowhere and everywhere, a warmth that sat in the air like a hand laid quietly on his shoulder. He looked at the old woman bending over his daughter. He did not speak. There were no words in him yet for what he wanted to say. The words would come later in the spring on his knees on her threshold. But the thing under the words was born in him that night. And it was born clean. And it was born whole. And he would not lose it for the rest of his life. Somewhere far down the valley at the edge of the settlement, a lantern moved in the darkness. It moved along the frozen road toward a small hollow in the hills where a man was searching for a mule that had broken out of its lean-to. That man was Jedediah Crane. But that is a story for the morning. For now, in the cabin that looked like a hill, the old woman drew the quilt up to the chin of a sleeping child, and she straightened slowly. Her hand pressed to her back, and she looked at her sister across the room. And her sister looked at her, and neither of them spoke, because they both understood now what they had built. It was not a wall. It was a hearth. and the wolf, for all his howling in the dark at the door, could not come in. Jedediah Crane rose before dawn on the morning of the 8th day. He had not slept. He had lain beside Winifred in the bed, listening to her shallow breathing and to the faster, more troubled breathing of his son on the pallet by the stove. And he had stared at the ceiling until the darkness above him began to soften toward gray. When he could no longer bear the stillness, he eased out from under the quilts, pulled on his wool trousers over his union suit, and went to the window. The thermometer outside read 28 below zero. He stood there for a long time. He watched the thin gray light come up over the Sawatch Range. He watched it lay itself across the hard crust of the snow, not as warmth, but as a kind of pale announcement that the day had begun. The valley was perfectly still. No smoke moved. No bird called. The cottonwoods along the river stood frozen into shapes like black ironwork against the sky. He went to the stove. He laid a log on the coals. He watched the flame take. He listened to the wood begin to hiss. And he thought, 9 days, maybe 10. And then I burned the bench, and then the table, and the door of the lean-to. And then what? He was not a man given to self-pity. He shook the thought off. He put on his coat and his muffler and his heavy boots, and he went out to check the animals. The mule, Jude, was gone. The lean-to door was open. The latch splintered where the animal had kicked through it in the night. The tracks led off along the south fence line and into the timber beyond. Jedediah stood in the yard, and he said aloud a word he would not have said in the house, and then he went back inside to fetch a lead rope. He told Winifred he would not be long. He said it the way a man says such things when he does not want his wife to worry. He saw in her face that she was not fooled, but she did not argue. She only put a hunk of cornbread and a twist of dried beef into his pocket, and she kissed him on the cheek, which she did not ordinarily do in the morning, and she said, "Come back to me, Jed." "I will." He walked out into the cold. It was the kind of cold that turned the air itself into a weapon. Each breath burned the inside of his nose. Each exhalation froze on his beard within seconds, building up in a pale, ragged crust at the corners of his mouth. The sound of his boots on the snow was a sharp, dry squeal, the way new snow sounds when it has been hammered into stiffness by the cold. Every branch above him, every twig, every fence rail was coated in a thick, crystalline frost that sparkled in the rising sun like a world sheathed in broken glass. He followed the tracks. Jude had gone south and west toward the creek. The tracks wove through a stand of cottonwood and down into a shallow draw. Jedediah went after them, his eyes streaming, his shoulders hunched inside his coat. He walked for nearly an hour. He saw no mule. He saw steam rising faintly from a frozen seep where a spring had refused to quit running. He saw the small, perfect tracks of a jackrabbit crossing and recrossing beneath the willows. He saw once the distant dark shape of a coyote moving along a ridgeline too thin and too slow, and he understood that the coyote was starving too, that the cold was killing everything that did not have a wall between itself and the sky. He climbed up out of the draw at the top of a low rise, and from that rise he looked down. He saw the whole valley spread before him in the hard light. He saw his own cabin a quarter mile to the east, and even at that distance he could see that the roof and the walls were white, glazed, every surface rimmed with heavy hoarfrost, the moisture of his own family's breath and cooking and sleeping having passed through the logs and frozen on the outside in a thick, white shell. His cabin looked like a cabin cast in sugar. He saw the Pritchett place farther down. Same thing. White, shimmering. A desperate plume of black smoke pouring from the chimney. Thick and fast, the smoke of a fire that was being overfed by a terrified man. And then in the near distance at the end of the settlement road, nestled against its slope with the creek, running frozen below it, he saw the Nagy place. And the Nagy place was wrong. In a landscape that was universally white in a world that glittered from horizon to horizon, with the crystalline coat of the deep freeze, the low, rounded shape of the old woman's cabin was a patch of dark, matte brown. There was no frost on it, no glaze, no rime, no sugar. The clay was bare. The clay was the color it had been in October when she was packing it with her bare hands. A thin, lazy curl of smoke rose from the chimney. The smoke of a small fire. A careful fire. A fire being kept, rather than a fire being fed. Jedediah Crane stopped walking. For a long moment he did not move at all. He stood on the ridge with the wind cutting sideways across his face, and he looked at the old woman's cabin, and his mind did something that his mind had not done since he was a boy. It reached for an explanation, and it could not find one. No, that was not quite true. It found one. It found the explanation immediately. The explanation had been sitting in the back of his skull for 2 months, ever since the afternoon he had sat on her step with his hat in his hands, and she had patted the wall and said, "The clay breathes." The explanation had been there the whole time. He had simply refused to pick it up. The reason there was no frost on her walls was that her walls were not cold enough to freeze the moisture in the air. The reason her walls were not cold enough was that her walls were not acting as walls at all. They were acting as something else. They were acting as a reservoir. They were storing the heat of her stove and the heat of her family's bodies and the heat of the winter sun that had been striking her south face for 2 hours of every clear morning. And they were holding that heat, and they were releasing it slowly, like water seeping from a deep well. What his cabin was doing, what Orville Pritchett's cabin was doing, what every cabin in the valley was doing was burning firewood at a furious rate and pouring that heat straight through the walls into the open sky. The frost on his roof was his own heat, visible, condensed, lost. The darkness of her walls was her heat, invisible, held, kept. He had been a carpenter for 30 years. He had never in 30 years understood a house until this moment, on this ridge looking down at the work of a 64-year-old widow from a country he had never heard of, before she had walked into his shop 18 months ago to buy a cabin from him. He began to walk down the slope. He did not know why he was walking to her cabin. He had not decided to. His legs had decided for him. He went down the rise and across the frozen draw, and he cut through the willow thicket and up the other side, and he found himself standing in the snow behind her north wall. The wall she had finished alone in the last week of November, the wall that had taken the full brunt of the northwest wind for 7 nights running. He was alone. She did not know he was there. The shutters were closed against the cold. He looked at the wall. It was a wall of earth. It was a simple, crude, unremarkable wall of packed earth. Nothing had been done to it to make it handsome. The surface bore the imprint of her hands. In several places he could see the shape of her palm pressed into the clay small, and spread a record of the labor that had built it. He took off his right glove. His bare hand stung instantly in the frozen air. The pain of it went through the skin into the bone within 3 seconds. He did not put the glove back on. He held his hand up in front of his chest for a moment as if steadying himself. And then he reached forward slowly, and he laid his palm flat against the wall. He was braced for a shock. He was braced for the hard electric cold of ice. He was braced for the bite of the freeze that had been taking his breath for a week. The cold that was the whole flavor of the world. Now the cold that had gotten into his son's small lungs and into his wife's finger joints and into the marrow of the valley itself. It did not come. What he felt was so unexpected that for a long moment he could not name it. It was not warmth. He was not a fool. He did not imagine that the wall was warm. But it was not cold either. Or rather, the cold of it was not the cold of the air around him. The cold of it was different in kind. It was a deep, stable, neutral cold. The cold of a thing that had its own temperature, the cold of a root cellar in August. The cold of the earth 3 feet down on a summer afternoon. It was not part of the savage cold of the day. It was not bleeding heat into the sky. It was not surrendering. And under that cold, under the surface, he could feel, or he thought he could feel, or his hand told him with an authority that would not be argued with a depth, a mass, a held thing, as if he had pressed his palm against the flank of an enormous patient animal, and could feel through the hide the slow, enormous calm of the creature breathing inside. He understood all of it, all at once. He understood everything that he had been refusing to understand for 2 months. He understood why the smoke from her chimney was thin. He understood why her chives were still green. He understood why the thermometer was reading 28 below zero, and her granddaughter was playing on a rug without a blanket around her shoulders. He understood that this old woman had done in October what he, with all his 30 years of joinery and all his professional pride and all his sawn timber and his corner notches and his hewn beams could not have done and would not have thought to do. She had given her house a body. She had given it mass. She had given it the ability to remember heat. She had taken the thin, papery shell that he had built and sold to her in good faith, and she had wrapped it in a living blanket of earth, and the earth was keeping her family alive, while his own family shivered inside the very best cabin in the Arkansas River Valley. He stood with his hand on the wall for a full minute. His fingers began to burn from the exposure. He did not move them. He could not move them. He did not feel humiliation, which would have been the simple emotion. He felt something larger than humiliation. He felt a thing that his grandfather's Lutheran preacher had called humility back when he was a boy in Pennsylvania. The preacher had said that humility was not thinking less of yourself. Humility was thinking of yourself less, because you had finally glimpsed the size of what stood outside your own skull. I have been a fool, Jedediah Crane thought. I have been a proud man, and I have been a fool, and that old woman saw it the day I sat on her step, and she was kind enough not to tell me. He took his hand off the wall at last. He pulled his glove on over fingers that were not yet frostbitten but would ache for hours. He turned and he walked around the corner of the cabin toward the south-facing door. He raised his hand to knock. He stopped. He stood there on the step for a moment with his knuckles an inch from the pine of the door, and he looked down at the boards under his boots, and he understood suddenly that he was not ready. He was not ready to face her yet. His eyes were hot. His throat had a thing in it that would not allow words. If she opened that door now in the gray morning light, and she looked at him with those calm gray eyes, he would not be able to speak a sentence without breaking. And that was not how a man presented himself to a teacher from whom he wished to learn. He lowered his hand. He turned. He walked back down the step and out through the yard, and he started home. He had forgotten about the mule entirely. Winifred was at the stove when he came through his own door. She looked up at him, and she saw his face, and she said quickly, "Jed, you did not find him." "No." "Is it the fever? Is Ephraim worse?" "Ephraim is no worse than he was." He stood in the middle of the room. He took off his hat. He looked at his wife, a woman he had been married to for 19 years, a woman whose face he knew the way. He knew the grain of a good oak board. And then Jedediah Crane, who had not cried since his own father had died 2 decades before, who had buried a brother dry-eyed and had stood at the grave of his first child with nothing on his face. But Winter sat down at his own kitchen table, and he put his head into his hands, and he wept. He wept without sound the way a grown man weeps in long heaving shudders that moved his whole shoulders and chest. Winifred did not come to him at first. She stood at the stove and she watched him, and she understood that something had happened to her husband in the cold that morning. Something that was not about a mule. Something that had reached into him and turned him over, the way a plow turns sod. After a while, she came to stand behind him. She put one hand on the back of his neck. She did not speak. At last, he drew a long breath. He wiped his face with both palms. He looked up at her. "Winnie, I have been the worst kind of proud man. I thought I knew what I was doing. I built this house. I built the Pritchett house. I built half the houses in this valley. And I have been wrong, Winnie. I have been wrong about the one thing that matters most in any of them. And there is an old Hungarian widow at the end of the road who has been trying quietly, politely for 2 months to show me, and I was too proud to see it." Winifred was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you going to go see her?" "Yes, in the morning, when my face is my own again." "All right." She did not ask him anything else. She went and fetched him a cup of coffee. The cold broke on the 12th night. It broke without fanfare. The wind came up, a warmer wind from the southwest, carrying the hint of moisture from far across the Colorado Plateau. The stars dulled. The mercury climbed slowly from 27 below to 20 below, to 12 below. And by morning it stood at 4 above zero, and 4 above zero felt like spring. By then the valley had its stories. The Larson boy, the bachelor on the north rim, had indeed frozen in his chair. He was the only direct fatality. But 3 families had lost most of a winter's worth of livestock. 5 homes had burned through more than 2/3 of their wood supplies in 12 days, and would have to purchase at hard prices enough to finish the winter. Orville Pritchett had burned 40 fence posts. Jedediah Crane had come within a week of burning his own workbench, and the story of the old woman's cabin began now to pass from mouth to mouth. It passed first in the way rumors pass, with a note of wonder and a note of disbelief. "Did you hear about the widow Naji? They say the whole cabin stayed warm. They say Orville Pritchett brought his sick girl there in the middle of the night, and the woman saved her. They say there was no ice on her water bucket." Then it began to pass more soberly. Men who had laughed at Farkas's folly in October did not laugh now. Men who had called her crazy looked at their own diminished woodpiles and at their own sick children, and at the ashes where their fence posts had been, and they were quiet. On the first clear morning after the break, Jedediah Crane put on his coat and his hat, and he walked the half-mile to the Naj cabin with his carpenter's rule and a small leather-bound notebook in his pocket. He walked with his hat in his hand. He knocked on her door, and Clara opened it, and Clara looked at him for a long moment, and then Clara stepped aside and let him in. Erzsébet was at the kitchen table. She was peeling potatoes with her right hand. Her left hand was still bandaged, and the two dead fingertips were wrapped in small cones of linen. She looked up at him. She did not stand. "Mr. Crane." "Ma'am." She waited. He turned his hat in his hands. He had rehearsed on the walk over a small speech. He had worked on it in his head for 2 days. Now, standing in her kitchen, with the smell of her coffee and her bread around him, and her gray eyes on his face, he could not remember a single word of it. So he said instead, the only word that had any truth in it, "Ma'am." How? It was not elegant. It was not what he had meant to say. But she understood. Her face, which had been guarded, softened. She set the potato down. She wiped her hand on her apron. She gestured to the bench across the table. "Sit, Mr. Crane. Sit. Clarica, bring Mr. Crane some coffee. Mr. Crane has walked a long way this morning." He sat. She did not gloat. She did not even allow herself so far as he could see the smallest private smile. She began to explain. She began at the beginning with the ovens of her father in the village outside Debrecen, and she worked forward slowly, patiently, in her thick, voweled English. And he took out his notebook, and he wrote, and he asked his questions, and she answered every one of them. And when he stumbled over a concept, she said it again differently, without impatience, the way she had spoken to Balint by the stove in October. They talked for 3 hours. When at last he stood to go, he put his hat on, and he looked at her and he said, "Ma'am, in the spring when the thaw is done, I would like to ask you a favor. I would like you to come to my place and tell me where the clay is good, and how deep to dig, and how to lay the first course. I would like to do for my house what you have done for yours, and I will pay you, ma'am, whatever you ask." Erzsébet looked at him. She was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Crane," she said, "I will come. I will show you, and you will pay me nothing. You will only do one thing." "Anything, ma'am." "When you have learned it, you will show the next man, and the next. You will not keep it, Mr. Crane. You will give it. That is the only payment I will take." He looked at her for a long time. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I can do that." He went. Orville Pritchett came on the first warm morning of April. The snow was still in drifts along the north fences, But the sun had teeth again, and the creek was beginning to run at its edges, and the air in the yard had the raw, wet smell of earth thawing. Orville came on foot. He was alone. He wore a clean shirt. He had shaved. He did not knock. He stood on the step, and he removed his hat, and he waited. After a while, Clara saw him through the window, and she opened the door. "Mr. Pritchett." "Ma'am, is your sister about?" "She is at the back. Would she—" He stopped. He swallowed. "Would she speak with me, ma'am? I would not blame her, if she would not." Clara went and fetched Erzsébet. Erzsébet came to the door. She looked at him. He looked at her. And then Orville Pritchett, who was a broad man of 51 who had never knelt to any human being in his life, except at the altar rail on his wedding day, lowered himself to one knee on the boards of her front step. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was thick. "My Prudence. She would be buried now. She would be in the ground, ma'am, if you had not taken her in that night. I came to this door 2 weeks before that, and I laughed at you. I called you out of your right mind. I told my neighbors you were a fool, and I told my own boy who told your granddaughter, and I made that child cry." Erzsébet did not speak. "I am not asking your forgiveness for me, ma'am. I do not deserve it, and I am not such a coward as to ask for a thing I do not deserve. I am asking your forgiveness for all of us, for all the men in this valley who would not listen to an old woman, who could not listen, because we thought we knew, and we did not know. And it took the life of my child almost going out of her body before I could hear what you had been saying all along." His shoulders shook once. He did not look up. Erzsébet stepped forward. She bent down. She put her good hand under his elbow, the right one, and she lifted. "Mr. Pritchett, get up. A man does not kneel on a doorstep." He got up. He would not look at her. "Look at me, Mr. Pritchett." He looked. She studied his face for a long moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron, and she took out a small handful of the ochre clay, the kind of clay she kept always now in a crock by her door, because she had begun to use it, as she had used it in Hungary, as a thing to put into the hands of children, and the sick and the troubled. She put the clay into his palm. She closed his fingers around it. "Go home, Mr. Pritchett. Go home and look at the north wall of your cabin. Think about the wind. Think about the shape of the ground. Think about where you would begin if you were beginning today. When you know, come back to me, and I will tell you if you are right." He looked down at the clay in his hand. He nodded. He put his hat back on his head, and he walked off down the road toward his own place, and he did not look back. And Erzsébet watched him go, until he turned at the bend, and then she went inside to finish her bread. That spring, Jedediah Crane burned his cabin. Erzsébet walked the ground with him on a morning in early May, and she showed him where the clay was deepest and where the bunch grass grew thick. And she explained to him with a patience that never seemed to leave her, that the first course must be laid on a bed of dry stone for drainage, because the snowmelt of a Colorado spring was a different animal from the slow autumn rains of Hungary. Crane took her advice. He dug, he hauled, he packed. She did not work with her hands except to demonstrate. Her hands were still bad. But she stood at the corner of his cabin with her shawl around her shoulders, and she watched and she pointed, and she said, higher and thicker, and no, Mr. Crane, no, you must break the grass. Smaller than that, smaller, smaller. Crane did as he was told. His back ached. His shoulders screamed. He had not been the student of anyone in 20 years. He found that he did not mind. By the time the cabin was finished, 3 more men had come to watch. By the middle of June, Orville Pritchett was bermed too. By August, there were 5 bermed cabins in the valley. And then the freight drivers began to notice. A freight driver is a man who does his calculations in cords and in hundredweight. He measures the world in the cost of hauling in the price of fuel in the weight of a wagon on a rutted road. A freight driver does not, as a rule, have time for gossip. Gossip does not fill his ledger, but numbers fill his ledger. And numbers, when they are strange enough, catch his eye. Horace Bell was a driver out of Canyon City. He was 35 years old, a lean man with a plain face who had been hauling supplies into the Arkansas Valley for 7 years, and who kept a private account book in which, out of long habit, he noted the winter fuel purchases of every household on his route. He did this because it helped him plan his loads, but also because in the evenings at his own cabin he liked to puzzle at the numbers and see what they told him. In the spring of 1882, he was looking at his book, and he noticed a thing. The Nagy household, widow and sister and 2 children, had bought from him across the course of the winter of 81 to 82 a total of 2 cords of firewood and 1/4 ton of coal. The Pritchett household, which was of a similar size in a similar cabin a half-mile away, had bought 5½ cords and 3/4 of a ton of coal, and had burned 40 fence posts on top of it. The Crane household, slightly larger but famously well-built, had bought 5 cords. The Hensley household down the road 4 cords. The Berryman household 4½. Horace Bell sat at his kitchen table on a May evening in 1882, with his ledger in front of him and a stub of pencil in his hand. And he looked at the 2 cords next to the name Nagy, and he circled it, and he sat back in his chair, and he whistled once long and low. He put the ledger down. He went to bed. But he could not sleep. He lay awake thinking about 2 cords of wood, about what 2 cords meant, about what it would mean if a driver on his route were to apply such a method to his own cabin, about what it would save him in a winter in cash money, about what it would save the settlers at the farther reaches of his route, the ones who sometimes in a bad year had to choose between buying another load of wood and buying another sack of flour. He got up. He sat down at the table again. He began to write a letter to his brother-in-law in Pueblo. That was how the thing began to move. Horace Bell bermed his own cabin that summer, with advice from Jedediah Crane, who had the advice directly from Erzsébet. Horace told the other drivers on the Canyon City road. Those drivers began to ask their customers to show them, and they began to carry the method in their heads and in their own ledgers and in their letters to kin up and down the freight routes of southern Colorado. By the autumn of 1883, there were 12 bermed houses in the Arkansas River Valley. By 1884, 25. By the autumn of 1885, the count stood at 43 houses and 11 outbuildings, scattered from Canyon City to the foothills of the Sawatch. The method had a name now. Some called it earth banking. Some called it the Hungarian method. And some, to Erzsébet's quiet private pleasure, called it the Nagy Wall. No one called it Farkas's Folly anymore. On an afternoon in the middle of October, 1885. Almost exactly 4 years after Erzsébet had first set her shovel into the clay, she was sitting on the bench outside her south wall. The sun was warm. She had a mug of coffee on the bench beside her. Her left hand, which had never fully recovered from the night of the crack repair, lay quiet in her lap. She was 68 years old. She was watching her granddaughter. Ildiko was 11 now. She had grown tall. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was bound back in 2 long braids. She was standing at the foot of the berm with a small trowel in her hand, and around her were gathered 4 other girls from the settlement. They ranged in age from 8 to 13. They were the daughters of the families who had burned their houses over the last 3 years. Ildiko had asked them to come on a Saturday because her grandmother had agreed to show them how to lay a first course. The girls were listening to Ildiko first. Ildiko was speaking in English that was quick and confident, and she was pointing at the wall. She was explaining the hollow grass. She was explaining the thickness at the base. Her small face was grave and bright, and she moved her hands the way Erzsébet moved her own. Erzsébet watched her, and her eyes stung. She remembered as clearly as if it had happened that morning, the night the child had come home from school, with frost still in her hair, and her lip trembling, and had told her grandmother that the Pritchett boy had called them dirty Hungarians. She remembered the promise she had made kneeling with her hands on that small, shaking body. One day, when you are old, you will tell this story to a child of your own. That day had not come yet. The child of her own was still many years away. But something else had come that Erzsébet had not foreseen. Something that her father, if he had been alive to see it, would have sat down on a bench in the sun and wept over. Her granddaughter was not going to be a woman who was told by a village that she could not handle fire brick. Her granddaughter was going to be the one who handled the fire brick, and who taught the other girls how to handle it, and who taught them too that they were allowed. Ildiko finished her part. She turned. "Nagy mama," she called in Hungarian. "Will you come tell them the thing about the clay that breathes?" Erzsébet set her mug down. She rose slowly, and she walked down the small slope to the foot of her wall, and the girls parted to make a place for her at the center. She laid her good hand on the wall. "Girls," she said, "my English is not so good. So listen. First, you must understand one thing before anything else. The earth is not a dead thing. The earth breathes. If you do not know this, you cannot build what I built. If you know it, you can build anything." The girls listened. She began to teach. There is a particular kind of wisdom that is held by people a civilization considers least worth hearing from. It is held by old women in country kitchens. It is held by immigrants with thick accents. It is held by craftsmen of trades that have been pushed aside by machines. It is held by grandmothers who tell stories nobody writes down. Our modern homes, with their sophisticated thermal analysis software and their phase-change drywall and their solar-heated concrete floors, are only now catching up to what Erzsébet Nagy did in the autumn of 1881. With a shovel and a wheelbarrow and 40 tons of Colorado clay. The principle she used is called thermal mass. The architects who rediscovered it in the 1970s were without knowing it. Walking a road, she had already walked a road her father had walked, a road that had been walked by every Kemencepitu in every village of the great Hungarian plain for 1,000 years. before any of them was born. What she knew in her bones was this: a house is not a box. A house is a vessel. A house is a thing that holds what you pour into it. Pour in heat, and it must keep the heat. Pour in love, and it must keep the love. Pour in a frightened child on a sub-zero night, and it must hold that child until morning. The thin wooden shell her neighbors built could not hold. It leaked. It leaked heat, and it leaked safety. And it leaked, in the end, the lives of the people inside it. What she packed around that shell was not a defense. It was an embrace. It was the earth itself drawn up and wrapped around her family, doing the thing the earth had always done in the old country, which was to hold what was precious through the long night. There is an old saying in the villages of her part of Hungary: what you pack around a house holds what you would lose. She did not translate it into English. She did not need to. Orville Pritchett learned it by going to his knees on her step. Jedediah Crane learned it by laying his bare hand on a frozen wall that was not frozen. Clara learned it by watching her sister go out into 30 below cold with a bowl of warm clay and come back with 2 dead fingertips and a mended house. Ildiko learned it by standing in her grandmother's kitchen with tears freezing on her cheeks and being told that the cold was coming and that she was gonna be all right. And we who are listening now, more than 140 years later, may learn it too. You may learn it from the story of an immigrant widow in Colorado who was called a fool by her neighbors and was proven right by a winter that killed its lesser men. You may learn it from the image of a 64-year-old woman kneeling in the snow at 30 below zero, pressing warm clay into a crack in a wall that she would not let fail. You may learn it from the way the best carpenter in the valley took off his glove and laid his hand against that wall and understood in a single silent moment that he had been wrong about the most important thing in his trade. Or you may learn it from the simpler truth at the center of the whole story. The strongest wall is not the hardest one. The strongest wall is the one that can absorb and hold and give back. Erzsébet Nagy lived for 11 more years after the winter of 1881. She died in her bed in the spring of 1892, at the age of 75, in a cabin whose earthen walls still held the warmth of the previous night's fire. At dawn, Clara survived her by 6 years. Balint grew into a man who kept his grandmother's trowel on a shelf above his own hearth. Ildiko grew into a woman who built with her own hands 3 houses in the valley, every one of them burned, every one of them warm. The cabin is gone now. The land is ranch land. The berm, settled and rounded by a century and a half of rain, is still faintly visible as a low rise in a meadow, if you know where to look. And if the light is right in the late afternoon, the wolf is still out there, of course. The wolf is always out there. The wolf is cold and age and time and every hard winter that is coming for every one of us. But so is the clay, and so always somewhere is an old woman who knows how to use it.